You're right now. Just a beer, guys. We're fine. Sound okay?
Right.
Don't fart, anyone. So, hang on. I can see this party's going downhill fast already. Okay, whatever. You ready to go?
I'm just getting the phone. When you're ready, just go for it.
Okay. All right. Terry, what is your vision for this film?
The vision started in 2015 on Anzac Day at Waikari. I started off with the 100 years, horses 100 years with the Anzac Day. And the reason why I started that was that over the many, many years, nothing's ever been told about the New Zealand Mounted Rifles. We've celebrated everything else, all the major events throughout Europe and Gallipoli. But the story of the Palestine campaign and Sinai all through there, it's literally been a forgotten story. A lot of stories have been made through the new Australian Light Horse, and the British war horses and all that. Nothing's ever been told. Like even in the Australian Light Horse movies and that, they never mention about the New Zealand Mounted Rifles. And the stories seem to be side-slipped, always in the background. And for me, I found that knowing my great-grandfather and my great-uncle all were in the Mounted Rifles from Nelson or from Takaka in that area, they were never mentioned, and it was really disheartening. And of course, on that particular day, I was actually standing on the steps at Waikari looking out towards the mountains, and this vision came to me in 2014. Why can't we do 100 years, 100 horses? So that's where it all started to build up. And then when we did it in 2015, it exceeded all our wildest expectations, including the local politicians, the police and everything. We literally had the biggest traffic jam you can imagine, all coming to see the 100 horses. And when we did the dawn service at the peaks, that was actually quite a special moment. I remember it very vividly. It was a very cold morning. There was not a cloud in the sky, and the sun had just come over behind the Cheviot. It was rising from the Cheviot across the plains, the Murray Basin plains. And the sky sort of went a reddish colour. And the eerie silence, you know, there was over 1,000 people at the dawn service in the middle of nowhere, unbelievable. And the silence was unbelievable. You could drop a pin. And then when we were playing the last post and the flags were drawn down, the horses neighed, just like if they're telling a story, the ghost of that whole story. And I must admit, I did get a cold shiver, and I think all the 100 riders were out there too. There was not a dry eye in the whole parade, and that was on the morning. Then we rode that 20 kilometres into Waikari. Again, there was over 6,500 to nearly 7,000 people who came stood on the steps and on the hills around where the old Waikari railway station used to be. So that's where the vision came from. And then the following year we went to Kaikoura, again a massive turnout. And then this year, 2016, I was asked, why don't we do a documentary? And we did a lot of research, and yeah, it was a possibility, but it still didn't tell the story of the men and the bond of the horses. My main aim was to actually not glorify the battles, but tell the story of the man and the companionship of their horses. Some of the men came off the mountains and they had a great bond with their own horses. The station owners, actually some of them, paid for their uniforms, their horses, all to go. So they were really passionate about what they're going. And of course, back in 1914, it was going to be a great adventure. So the first wave that went, that was all the volunteers, and this war was going to be over in a few months, was the story that came out of Britain. But for me, for this story, it had to be about the man and the horse, because the horse in 1914 was a part of New Zealand growing up as a nation. If we didn't have the horses, we as a nation couldn't develop the farms or anything like that. So it was a very powerful tool. Yes, a lot of farmers looked upon as a horse as a working animal, and nothing was ever further from the truth, because in a sense they had that bond, and the young men, when they went, they knew that's going to be them. So they came down off the hills, the mountains, the farmlands and everything, and they congregated. It got bigger and bigger. The troops got more and more, climbing onto the old trains, loading them on, going to major camps like Riccarton and Addington, and then finally the first wave went over and landed at the Suez Canal. So briefly, the first wave arrived there, and of course a lot of the stories, the whole idea was that they were going to protect the Suez Canal from the Turkish Empire. Then the plan was to invade Gallipoli. Now, there's been a lot of stories done on Gallipoli, untold films, everything. We're not focusing on that story. Yes, the mounted rifles left their horses in the Suez Canal, so every fourth man stayed behind to look after the mounts that was left behind, and the rest went to Gallipoli, did their, all the battles, and a lot of the mounted rifles actually died in Gallipoli. The Otago mounted rifles, the regiment down there, were literally massacred. They were the worst of them all, and they never really reformed after Gallipoli and when they all came back. The Canterbury mounted rifles, one of the things that they were one of the last to leave Gallipoli, and they were known as the diehards because they were on the beach and they were the last ones, and they were nicknamed the diehards. So, and one of the books was mentioned that's what they were doing, so that's the way they went. They came back to the Suez Canal pretty well shell-shocked, beaten. They had, the Gallipoli campaign was a disaster, military, and we all paid a big high price for our men to go over. So they came back to the Suez to regroup, and the objective was to protect the Suez Canal at all costs, because if they'd lost the Suez Canal, the supply line to Britain was gone. So it would have had to gone right around the bottom, and it would have put Britain in a bigger situation. So the second wave, was called the reinforcements, came from New Zealand to supplement all the losses that they had in the mounted rifles. In their planning, they decided that the Otagos, they couldn't really reform. So it was a small squadron went to the France and Belgium. So it only left the Canterburys, the Aucklands, and Canterburys, Aucklands and Wellingtons. So that was the bulk of the New Zealand mounted rifles. Then there was the machine gun squadron, which was attached to each of those regiments, so it made up a full. Normally in each regiment there was around about 550 men and horses, and then you had all your light horses for carrying, all the heavy horses to carry machine guns and equipment, and then you had the camels squadrons who carried water and back up all the massive equipment to bring in the fodder and that to the horses. But for me, I still felt that we needed to tell the story of that man and the bond of the horse. Okay, yes, they went through the battle and everything, but there's so many stories that we have, like there was a set of twins that went to, in the first wave, they both left their horses in Egypt, they went to Gallipoli, one of the twins died, and then when they came back into Sinai in the Suez, his opposite twin, he was actually with his own horse in the picket line, gathering up and sorting out all their gear, and his twin brother's horse broke ranks further down the line, came galloping to him, thinking, where's the other twin? And apparently a lot of the men couldn't hold back the emotion to find that they went with their horses, they had that bond and they kept building it. So that's sort of one of the stories. There's another story of father and son. The son joined up and then the army said no, the father was too old, he was in his 60s and he was a very sprightly 64-year-old, fit as a buckrat and everything sort of going like that. So his son went over, did Gallipoli, came back. He was in the Wellingtons. So his father, not beaten, decided, all right, I'm going to the South Island. And he decided to go and join up with the Canterbury Mounted Rifles. Lied about his age. He says, oh yeah, I'm 40. And he did look like 40. He was a fit young guy, the whole 9 yards. So he conned his way into that. So he arrived in Suez and his son was walking it out and his father says, hi son. And he nearly fell off his horse. What are you doing here? And then the truth came out that he wasn't a 40-year-old man and he was 60. Because of his expertise in the horses, the army relented and kept him. So they tried to get him into a clerical job and all that. And he says, no, I've signed up to be a soldier. I will be a soldier. And he managed to wrangle himself to get transferred into his son's squadron. And he came to be the number 3 man in his squadron. So right through. The stories go, and it's well and truly documented, is that yes, the father died while in battle. And right to the bitter end, he had his rifle. He actually was put on a stretcher. He suffered a mortal wound. He had his stretcher. Because the battle was advancing forward, he was left behind. They covered him up there and they gave him his rifle and he died with his rifle, knowing he served his country. Some of the things that really came out too during the World War I, especially in our history, the censorship. A lot of, like the Australians, the British, the Indians, they had reporters implanted in to tell the stories back to the people where they, like back in England and India and Australia. New Zealand had none. It was virtually like a forgotten brigade. And the censorship was very strict because there have been a number of letters where the young fellows have written their stories and you can just visualise as he's writing his story to his family and then sitting by his horse, because a lot of the men used to sit beside their horse, because that was the only companion they had. They'd be sitting there in the deserts and the howling and they'd be right there. And you can visualise the censorship man on the other side of the page, black line, black line, black line. Then in the next bit you'd see the mother reading the letter, dear mum, black line, black line, black line. Love you mum, dad and sisters, see you soon. And that's all she would have. And it'd be many a times when that mother would, a few weeks later, would see the telegram boy, and when they ever saw that coming out the drive, they knew they were always bringing bad news. So they'd get this letter and the censorship. And because the New Zealand Mounted Rifles weren't really told the story, they were known as the Coldfoot Mounts. Because the people in New Zealand, and because they had no knowledge or information what the Mounted Rifles were doing, but they heard all the stories coming out of Europe and France and Belgium and all that, they knew all that, never knowing what the New Zealand Mounted Rifles, they were always under the impression that the Mounted Rifles were sitting under a palm tree on the beaches of Palestine, having a wonderful time. In actual fact, it was the opposite. The hard part for the men was lack of water, lack of food, the hygiene was unbelievable. 70% of the men that went over there came home with false teeth because of the hard tack. It was all these stories came out where no one really knew about it. The when they say like in Belgium, all that, in the mud and the rain, well, the mounted rifles had the same thing when they were going up to the Jordan Valley and all that. And the cold, they were poorly equipped, and it was never told. The Australians did their troops justice by telling the stories back home to the families. But New Zealand knew nothing. And so they were knowing that. There was many a times when a young soldier, we used to send these care packages, with biscuits and socks, the whole 9 yards. And they'd open it up. Oh, great. And there'd be a note in there. I hope this is not going to the cold-footed mounts. It was so disheartening for those soldiers to see that. And they couldn't tell the story of what was really going on. There's stories of the hardship, what they endured, like the men chewing the fodder for the horses to make it moist because the lack of water, it was unbelievable. So they would chew the food for the horse and moisten it and then give it to the horse. They would share their last, they'd get a pint of water, and sometimes they would go 72 hours, not a drop of water. Blazing heat, we talk about hot here, even in Australia, but there have been recordings in the Middle East at that time. They had unbelievable heat waves that was unimaginable. The horses were dropping with the saturation of the heat, and they were just feeding them a little bit of water. So that's where the man and the horse, or the young men and their horses, they grew a really strong bond. In the desert storms, you get the winds and that, they used to throw a little canvas bag over their heads with the horses and stand there huddled while the huge storm would, the wind was unbelievable and you were breathing sand. Can you imagine the pain for both of them, and then they'd survive it. It may go on for 3 or 4 days. They'd be living in squalid condition. But we had the horse hospitals, we had the men hospital, there was dysentery, there was cholera, everything. But they never really knew back home in New Zealand what these men were going through. So for my passion, and my great-grandfather, and my uncles, and all that who went, I really want to tell that story. We've got the stories of Bess, who came home, and there was 3 others. Not surely documented, but there were 3 others. We sent 10,000 horses over, plus. Australia sent 120,000. Only 1 came home for Australia. And the heartbreak of knowing when the orders came, no horses to come home. It was only the officers that managed to get there, like Bess and that. But going through 4 years of hell, and they really bonded. Okay, sometimes they lost horses on the way, and then they grew into the next one, and they knew that was their lifeblood. They'd charge in, do their thing, dismount, run, back out, go. And quite often the horses grew that bond. As soon as they heard that voice, bang, oh, here he is, and bang, let's go, And they struggled. There was times when the men were badly hurt and the horses, and the young man would crawl to his horse and they'd die together. There was stories of that. We're not telling it. It's about the man and the bond. And if we look through history, we still got that today. You see the pony clubs, we've got all that. And New Zealand is a great nation of horses. We've had Farlat. I know the Australians try to steal that one. All that sort of thing, And we have famous history of our horses, Cardigan Bay, the famous trot horse, the whole 9 yards. We are a horse. You got Sir Mark Todd, Charisma. That line of history goes all the way down. And then if you look at the Queen's horses in England, the mounted horses, they are some of the descendants of the horses that came from Canterbury, with the white blaze, the big shoulders. So our horses, when at the end of the war, the best were taken to England, the rest was given to the locals, and the C-class was shot. Now, a lot of the men made damn sure if they couldn't go to England, they got into that C-class. So their best mates shot each other's horses. That's how the stories go. You know, it was never sort of really documented, but yeah, like in my grandfather's diaries, yeah, he shot his horse. And my uncle there, they did the same. You know, they said, no one's going to get my horse. And they made sure it was a category C. So that's the story that we need to tell, is really what you guys have to put on paper to make, you know, we had the famous battles, we've had Beersheba, we've had going through Jerusalem, right through Ramah, all them, but we really have to focus on the man and the horse, because remember, he came back to New Zealand, the survivors, and their stories were never told. It was just, that was happening over there, end of story. They never talked about it. I remember my grandfather seeing her brother holding he managed to smuggle his bride's horse home, because they weren't allowed to bring anything home. And he would spend maybe hours in the back paddock, just looking towards the mountains and saying, with a tear in his eye, and she'd go up to her brother, what's the matter? He wouldn't say anything. Oh, I'm so okay, sis, I've just got a bit of dust in my eye. And he'd quietly go back, hang the bridle. But no one was ever allowed to touch that bridle. He'd hang it up in the shed, it'd stay there. And every now and again, he'd pick it up. And it usually, quite often, when the storm clouds were running over the top of the mountains, he'd be out there holding, just standing there. And his little dog, he never ever rode another horse. And he just sort of quietly went through like that. So I'm trying to instill something totally different. Yes, I heard a lot of stories, but this. And we've got a proud history. And if you look at what the New Zealand Defence Force and the Army, a lot of the battles that these guys did is actually to the forerunner of when the Second World War, the Long Range Desert Group, because the New Zealanders were renowned in the First World War, and especially in the Mounties, to go behind the enemy lines, and they'd spend maybe 20, 30 miles. You know, we're not talking about kilometres, 20 to 30 miles going behind the enemy line, you know, doing skirmishes and pulling up railway tracks and just creating havoc, distraction. And with their horses, you know, like the Aucklanders, they went in there and ripped up railway tracks, you know, and then bolted back home, or back to base, you know, and all these sort of skirmishes, and they did outflanking, you know. And even the generals in England always commented that the New Zealand horses were the most superior horses in the desert. Even begrudgingly, the Australians had to agree. It's not often, but they had to agree that the New Zealand horses were in far better condition, and the men were more passionate to look after their horses, and they had that bond. Again, that's why I want to tell the story. This is our history. So with that sort of history behind us, it developed into a form of battles. Okay, we had the Long Range Desert Group, all that sort of things. Then we come into the SAS. So all that sort of our history, and we've forgotten it, that our proud tradition, that even like, for me, you know, I was a soldier back in the 70s. I wasn't a very good one. I spent more time getting into trouble, but besides the point. A typical West Coaster, I was always in trouble, but never mind. You know, pranks was my name of the game. But for me, we've forgotten our true history, and whereas like Australia, they got the light horse, the historical troops, in England, in United States, in Canada, they have made a special effort to make the horses part of the history, part of the Defence Forces, is because that's where part of our modern history started. So for us, New Zealanders, we have let ourselves down badly. And with the New Zealand Mounted Rifles Charitable Trust, that's what we're trying to encourage. We go to schools and say, well, this is what these guys did, and we want to make the stories like that. So bring our true history and be proud of it. That's what I want. It's not glorify what we've done, but it's a history of the hardship, the pain, and the broken hearts And sometimes it was the betrayal, what they've left the men of the mountains to come home. That's, yeah.
That's good.
I was just wondering, have you got your folder here today?
Yeah, she's got it right there.
Oh, that's right. I was just going to flick through and see.
Yeah, no, go for it. Yeah, I've highlighted some of the stories and bits and pieces in there.
Shall I use that to-
Yeah. So,
Yeah, maybe
I'm rolling.
do what exactly what you were just talking about just then.
just the history of me?
Casually, yeah.
Yeah. It's a disaster. You can't go. You know, I'm a walking disaster. Break everything that goes. Mm.
How
So-
old were you when you started to get in with the horses? How old
My first experience in horses was probably at a tender age of about 8 or 9, and but my childhood was back in the 50s was quite brutal because my mother was an alcoholic, and I did not know my father in those days, and so I ended up in foster homes, and it was quite a brutal from going from foster home to foster home. There was rape and bashings and beatings, the whole 9 yards. I was a pretty troubled young lad. I ran away from home many times because I get away from the brutality of it. It went on. I could go into detail, but it's pretty graphic. Then in those days, troubled lads used to be sent off and get the CT, the shock treatment and all that. So yeah, we had all the whole 9 yards. I eventually escaped from it as a young 14-year-old. Probably about 16, 17, I couldn't read or write, not a thing. So yeah, and I was very fortunate that an old couple from the high country picked me up. They said nothing, they just knew that I was a young lad on the run, took me home, gave me a feed, gave me a bath, the whole 9 yards, and they said, now you got to work for your keep. So, which I did. I was on a station and grew from there. So I was, right up until I was about 18 or 19, I was pretty quiet, in the back country, and that's where I got my real fond for the high country, the love of the horses. They were my only companion. And so to me, it went home. And then I joined the army. I wasn't a really good soldier. I think I was a disaster. But I loved it. It was like a family. And that's where I always fell in love. Even though I think some of my commanding officers used to throw their hands up and they think, oh, Jesus, what is he into now? And so, yeah, I was there right up until the 80s. And then I left that, and then I joined up with the Alpine Cliff Rescue in Greymouth. And then I did 10 years there. There was a lot of comradeship. We not only went up in the mountains, we did cave rescues, we did mine rescues the whole night. So it was like a community. And again, I actually developed myself into a contractor. It's probably one of the first contract drivers in the transport industry back in the 70s, 80s. That, yeah, sort of rocked the boat with the union. I wasn't too popular there, but but that was fun. But for me, I was a very independent person. Got married. My first marriage was, it was a bit of a disaster. I think I was looking for all the wrong reasons, because what I missed out as a childhood, I thought when you get married, it was going to be all roses, the whole 9 yards. It blew apart on me. I had 2 boys, and they've grown up to be great lads, but they've long gone overseas, so I don't see them now. So that's a bit of a pity. And then my marriage blew up, and then I went back into the mountains, and then I was lucky that I had a good friend, and I ended up working on some of the films like Vertical Limit, Lord of the Rings, Lion and the Witch and the Wardrobe. So it grew and grew and grew. And then when it was about that time, I ended up getting very sick with the big C. That didn't help. And it's quite funny because when you get sick, all the friends that you think you've got, they just disappear. It's like you're contagious.
Yeah.
And I had no friends, and as I was lucky, I had a 14-year-old boy, and it was just him and I. And because I was a solo dad and brought all the kids up, so yeah. So I eventually got back into the workforce through a good friend of mine, which is Steve Carpenter, local Christchurch lad. So he gave me my chance and break, and I got back into doing the big shows and all that. So it sort of grew into that. But over the years, I've been very adventurous. I did break a lot of things in the bones, which there's a file about that big. You know, oh God, he's broken something else, you know, and I was notorious, you know. Over the years, people used to say it was risk because of what I'd gone through as a child. And when I was working with United Nations back in the late 80s and 90s, and I went overseas and worked in hot zones, my job was rescue coordinator logistics, you know, getting people out of very bad situations. We did see a lot of shocking things, you know, what children's, I thought, went in my childhood, and then I saw it was a lot worse. And I thought, well, I wasn't so bad after all, you know, okay, yeah, I went through some brutality and rape and all that, but what I saw the children going through in the hot zones and that really was an eye-opener. So I sort of made it my passion to always help children. I still do it today. And so that, yeah, I got again injured and all that, so yeah, the files get bigger and bigger. So ACC used to, I think they dread me now because, you know, it gets bigger. What else has he broken, you know? So it sort of goes on through there. And then I was very lucky when I was in my recovery stage from the big C. I met a wonderful lady called Nikki. She's only 5 foot minus. She's a gorgeous honey, you know, and she was a free spirit too. You know, she's had a rough time in her life. We all both, and we knew the downs of low life and everything. But you know how something it just clicked, and we have had some, you know, real big giggles and laughs in it. But we never ever got down because it was each other to help each other. And when I started this project, like the Anzac 100 horses, 100 years, she said, "You're barking mad." I said, "Yeah, I know, but you're gonna come with me?" She says, "Oh yeah, but you're still bloody barking mad. You know what you're letting yourself in for?" I said, "Oh, okay, yeah." I said, "Well, got a few friends." She said, "How many?" I said, "Oh, I don't know, 2." And so we went on this journey, and that's how the 100 Years, 100 Horses started back in 2014. And she's been my rock all the way through, and when we've had the disappointments, the people that, you know, said, it's not going to happen, they turned us down, all this sort of thing. So that's where she's been my rock. And if it wasn't for her, we'd never be sitting here talking today. So for me, is how my life. So yeah, it's been a rocky road, but I have learned in the last probably few years to be a lot more understanding. We all grow up. And I've just found, like in my late 50s and 60s, well, nothing's black and white. No. It's all going to be, you know, it's going to be. But, you know, I've had people from the army who rung me up, and I just sat there and listened. I said, I can listen, but I can't, you know, I may not be able to help, but let's talk about it. And my GP, John, he's been brilliant because, yes, I do suffer the bad nightmares of the horrible things, the death and destruction that I've seen. You know, oh God. And it does come back to haunt you. But I think it's very important that, like with the mounted rifles, we're actually helping some of the soldiers to be able, you know, we're raising funds for them, to like for the homes here in Christchurch, like with I think it's Arena House, where, you know, there's like hospital equipment and all that. So that's part of our goal. So it gives us a purpose to run the horses, to raise those monies. So yeah, there's two folds, and as I say, with the history, what I'm really passionate about is that I need to tell that story on behalf of the Mounties, because no one else will do it. There's some brilliant books out by Terry Kinloch. He's written a brilliant book. There's a lot of old books written from Major Powell, Moore, all them have been really brilliant books, but not really been out in the public. People don't understand. And I think with the 100 horses, the 100, it's actually brought it out physically. Yeah. One of the things that we notice, you know, when we do the parades through the streets and that, and it's quite often I look over my shoulder because I teach all our riders, look forward, be proud, you are telling the history, there are no wavings, no smilings, no fake cameras. People will take photos, we can get them later. But you're there to take the history and the ancestry of what went before us. Ride tall, ride proud. And I drum that into them. But every now and again you look over your shoulder and you see a lot of the generation even younger than me will have a tear. Some of them will be crying. And you know they're crying because they've got the hanger and dabbing their eyes. And the fascinating part is that the young ones, when we stop, we let them come around the horses and everything to have a look and just tell them. They are so enthralled. They say, we never see this at school. We never hear these stories. And we're forgetting it. And that's why, if we can make a film, because a picture tells 1,000 words. The slightest, and that's where I want to get this whole passionate story going.
Do you want to talk about the lack of a journalist and how that made it all appear in complete darkness, and maybe even why it seems the story hasn't come out really? I mean, there's all these books, but they haven't been pushed.
Well, a lot of the stories, like during the war campaign, the censorship was very high. And a lot of the diaries and the stories that came out after the war, when a lot of the men came back and had their diaries. So there was, when they were writing their letters, the censorship was pretty horrific. It got back and then it was censored. But even when the men died and that, some of their comrades all used to pick up their diaries, put it in there, because they knew there was censorship. And because they started picking up the vibes back from New Zealand, with the letters going to them, they realised no one knew what they were really going through. So a lot of the men hid their diaries and brought them home. And even today, some of the diaries are coming out of the woodwork that haven't seen for 100 years. So you've got this untold story still popping out, like even today, we're still receiving diaries that have never seen a light of day.
The letters sent from family to the men, were they also censored?
Yes.
They were.
Yes, even like when the family wrote back to the men, their letters were censored and vice versa coming back. So quite often, and I've seen my grandfather's, great-grandfather's letters, and they've kept them in the family diaries, black lines all the way, and they'd only leave in little parts. And so their mother or dad would be reading it and they'd be trying to decipher what was going on. So, that's the whole story is going through. So we found after the war, it was all the history came out. And that's when it started to realise that people, and then like Terry Kinloch, when he started doing the research, he went through all the diaries and he found that there was a lot of untold stories. So that's why during the war, nobody knew what the Mounties were doing. Because in Europe, because there was such a vast there, like the Americans, the stories were all coming out. Yes, yeah, and because of the high casualty rate in Europe, it was in the papers, big long lists of men, 900 die one day there. New Zealand didn't have a very high casualty rate in the desert, but because there's such a small number of them, it didn't register in the press. So you've had this sort of distorted thing. And yet their campaigns were just vital, or more important, because the Suez Canal had to be protected. Now, like modern Israel and through Jerusalem and Palestine and that, they were liberated after Turkey had controlled it for hundreds of years. So it was the modern era of actually the liberation of that whole.
So was there a lot of media around that? Maybe even just in newspapers in that area?
No.
Being liberated by.
There was very little media coverage when they were going through. It was only through the British going back to England. But see, even like the news in England was not coming back to New Zealand, it was censored badly. And even the politicians didn't really know, like with the Gallipoli campaign, that was a fiasco. And the New Zealand politicians were horrified at our casualty rates in Gallipoli, and they started arguing. And that's when we changed from British commanders to New Zealand commanders, and the same with the Australians. They said, enough's enough. We're losing men, because the British commanders from the old school, and they were still thinking 18th century battle commands, they said that was it. And so a lot of the New Zealand commanders started taking charge. And then, like in the Mounties, they started working and planning much more, and their losses were a lot less. But a lot of their raids were more daring. You know, they were going 60, 70 miles behind the enemy line, creating havoc. Well, that's not bad on a horse, you know, and in blistering heat. It was unbelievable. So,
What are some examples of some of the havoc that they caused?
well, some of the havoc's easy, you know, they went in, there was a story where the Aucklanders went in behind the lines and they were going to rip up a railway track. But as they were about to make a start on it, in the distance they saw this train coming, you know, toot toot, and there was over a few thousand troops on it. So they thought, well, they can't actually rip this track up. Well, they'd be outnumbered, outshot, the whole 9 yards. So they quietly stepped off into the area with their horses, stood very quietly in the moonlight, nothing was on it, and a bit of a scrub, and this troop train chuckled on past with a few thousand troops on it. They were lucky, no one saw them. So when the train went past, they ripped the line up, back. The train came back, fell off the tracks. Hello.
Would that train have been in dark because it was at night?
Yes, it was, yeah. They heard it.
Yeah.
They heard it coming. You know, of course, in the desert at night, on a moonlight night, they could hear it going, you know, and it was, you know, because every time it went over a joint, it went clack-a-dack, clack-a-dack.
Lights, but you hear it.
You could hear it, yeah. You couldn't see it, but you could hear it. And so, you know, click-a-dack, and on a still night, sound travels well. So they went off, and even when they were standing in that, one of the soldiers thought one of the Turkish troops was actually looking at him directly in the desert. Never said a word, carried on to the front. Because they derailed that train on the way back, after some of the campaigns, and a few days later, they captured 10,000 Turks, part of the battles. So these raiding parties created havoc everywhere. So you had these little skirmishes. There's so many in the books, you know, you can tell, even like what I've given you, you just, how the hell they do it? And some of them were riding up to 72 hours, not a drop of water.
That's the same, water.
Water was the biggest enemy for them out there. And, you know,
When you think about American history, they would poison wells and waters. And
yes,
that.
blow the wells up.
Did they do that
Yes.
here as well?
Yes.
Okay. So,
Yeah, so when the Turks retreated, they would blow the wells up and just deny, they don't blow all the tracks up on the retreating, you know, they destroy the wells. Like the famous Battle of Beersheba.
yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
Yes,
so, but that was not only the problems they had. Now, in the desert, you've got these cactus hedges, you know, with the big thorns on. And so the horses couldn't get through it. So the men would be actually chopping their way through these cactus hedges while the Turks are on the other side shooting at them. But in the meantime, they're trying to chop their way through so they get through without being shredded. So, and then they get through. There's another story where they were chasing the Turks. It must have been quite hilarious, I would have thought, you know, in real life, is that the Mounties went charging in and it was a golden opportunity and the Turks were on the mounts. So they didn't bother dismount. They just went after them. Took out their bayonets and off they came, you know, and they were knocking them off their horses. It's probably one of the very few charges where they actually was horse on horse. So, you know, these...
This was in Turkey, was it?
This was in Sinai and Palestine, yeah. So you had these little skirmishes, you know, going around. Like...
That leader with the Turkish railway, is that the railway story you were referring to?
Yes, that's the one, yeah. Yeah, and, you know, when the men rode home, they put it so politely, didn't they? They just wrote, oh, we had a jolly good time, you know, the whole 9 yards. Well, come on, guys. Yeah, but a lot of the men that went over, their diaries were very brief. The reason why is a lot of them couldn't read or write. So they learnt to write basic things. So they didn't embellish on the stories or anything like that. It was very brief. Today we went out, shot, few, came home, back, bivvied. Bang, that's it. That's their diaries. So you have to work out what really happened in some of the stories. You think, oh, okay, they did this, you know. And then when they say 70 miles, well, you know, it was bloody hell. You know, I complain I run 2 miles when I was in the army and think, that was bloody hell. You know, I think, gee, come on. You know, sweating like hell. And I'm thinking, 70 miles for a horse? And that's why the New Zealand horses had that reputation of being the best in the desert campaign. The endurance of those horses were really exceeding. Even the British commander had to eat humble pie and say, yes, it's in the books that say, yeah, they were great horses. And we don't tell that, and people didn't know about that. And that's why, you know, I'm quite passionate about the horses, but I know, like, we breed the best horses in the world. I don't care what they say. Yeah, I'm a bit biased, but, you know, we've got some great champions. So you've got all these stories, you know, like...
What were the Turkish horses like? Did they have good horses?
No, they were skinny as anything. They were malnutrition.
Did you hear about Arabian horses? So I think about Arabian horses.
No, never heard of them.
Never, so
No, that sort of came out of Lawrence of Arabia, all the stories. So if you look at his stories and the history, you really got to pull it apart and you think, nah, you know, and it's really fabricated for the movie. Yeah. Lawrence of Arabia had a free reign and they took Baghdad. They were in the central of the desert campaign. They were way over to the I think it'd be the east, yeah, and where the mountains, the Australian light horse, the yeoman cavalry, which was from England, the Indian cavalry, they were there, and some of the South Africans were there. We went...
This Indian unit as well, wasn't there?
Yes, there was a lot of Indian units. Yes, we took to Gaza, up through the coast, right heading towards Syria, where we finally, when the armistice was signed, we were already in Syria, going up through there. So we took the heavy populated routes where Lawrence of Arabia went across to Baghdad, and all these were sparsely miles and miles of nothing, then a small town, then so they went that way. We took the Suez, and because all the shipping was in the Mediterranean too, so the Turks had a lot of shipping coming down to offload onto the beaches to try and protect. And of course, not only the Turks, there was also Germans. The Germans were heavily involved in the Sinai campaign. You know, they had German commanders, so yes, they had a lot. We had German Air Force, they were there bombing the plane. You know, there was a lot of story, you know, men would stand by their horses, try and protect the bombs when they were flying over. You know, that's the passion that we don't tell, you know.
There's a good bit in the Light Horseman of the aeroplane,
Yeah.
and the boys really trying to protect the horses,
Yep.
and
We're doing-
scarpering and holding on to 4 horses, you know,
Yep.
and that's what was quite
That's
exciting.
where, you know, we don't tell about, you know, and, you know, they were really passionate about the horses. They'd try anything.
Yeah, the boy had all his hands ripped off, you know,
Yeah.
hanging onto the chains.
Yeah. Yeah, because they had chains in there, you know, to hang, you know, for the picket lines, you know. So you've got chains you're hanging on to, you know. You know, so you'd have it clipped on. And, you know, the protection for the horses was paramount to them because the men went out of their way because that was their life. Because without the horse, they were nothing.
Yeah, and horse was nothing without man.
Yes,
They all lived
they were part of the story. And one of the things is like the British and the French and all them high commands and back in England and France said the horse has done its day with the cavalry. It was not going to be anything. But it actually proved its worth in the desert because when the British sent over all this heavy equipment, you know, the wagons and all that, they just bogged into the sands. The horses left them behind. They were always in the rear guard. Even the infantry struggled to keep up with the light horse and the Mounties because they would go, so the mountains had to come back so the troops would all catch up because they were so fast. They went ahead, they had to come back because the infantry couldn't keep up, or the heavy artillery, they just couldn't keep up. We could cover a huge amount of ground.
Horses for the heavy artillery?
Yes, there was heavy with the dragging the wagons and everything because there was times where they had to lay brushes down so the wheels wouldn't sink down. So they actually ended up going to lighter equipment, like the machine gun horses, you know, carrying all the gear, so they could go faster to go across country. Because there's been many times when the New Zealand mounts, there's a couple of stories where the New Zealand mounts went charging in, and the Australians they dug in, and then during the night, the Kiwis, one of the commanders of the Kiwis says, "Where are the Australians?" They'd actually pulled them back, didn't tell the Kiwis, and the Kiwis are holding the line all by themselves. The comments was, "Oh, the bloody Aussies are pissed off again," But but that's what it did, and you think, and to hear these stories, you think, Jesus, they were, and so the communications was quite bad. Quite often they were left holding the bag.
So that was simply a communication.
Yeah, it was all a communication breakdown. They'd be left holding them, and then they'd eventually get the order to retreat. But in the meantime, the Kiwis had been flogging it out, and they'd been holding the line. What are they all leaving for?
All right, we're going to cut there.
Yeah, geez, you honest.
Why don't I just mention something just from before, just as my little 2 cents, that New Zealanders are reserved, and we've got a tall poppy syndrome, so maybe the Australians, the UK, have got a lot of good stories, because they don't mind talking themselves up. We've always been reserved. And even if we do something great, we never blow our horn.
Well, that will be
If we can kind of like have that in the personality of the country.
Yeah.
it does.
The Australians are like, oh, we must write that down and promote that.
Yeah,
Whereas
but we didn't.
It's like, we did all this good work, we don't need to know about it.
Yeah, and that was the common thread through the war. Kiwis never, it was a brief sentence, "Dear Mum, we had a bit of a skirmish today, did that, captured a few, come home." Well, they wouldn't even put the number, the date, go down. One-liners. Kiwis always run understated.
Whereas somebody, because what I've noticed is I find two old fellas that love talking about the war, or ones that don't want to talk about it at all.
Yeah.
And a friend of mine said once, he said, you'll notice that some of the ones that talk about it a lot might not have been as involved, and they embellish.
Yeah.
Whereas those that were really in the thick of it are over it and just don't want to go there again.
Yeah, well, we all go through that. Like even in my time, people say, "Oh, what did you do?" I said, "Oh, yeah, I was just over there." Okay, fine. Yeah, it got messy. Yeah, things got hurt and all that, but that's it. But I never, if I was to tell them, they'd all be chucking up in the seats. Yeah. So yeah. But yeah, and a lot of men are like that, and I think the ones who are the quiet ones know the real story. And you get the ones who say, "Oh, the whole 9 years." Yeah, you might have been there in the back seat or in the kitchen or somewhere like that. But the ones who are out on the front line, they take it hard. They usually come home reserved, never say anything. And it even happens in a modern day soldier, and it's still happening. Like the men have come back from Afghanistan, East Timor, all that. There's some really dark secrets they keep, and it's really sad. And we do not. And that's even in World War I, when the men came home, they were forgotten.
And that's like every war.
Yep. Second World War, the same. Just get back to life, do your job, make the economy grow. They forget about what the damage these poor men were. We were great in World War I. We built memorials everywhere. Every town you see has got one. Australia wasn't so great on that. And like in Gallipoli, we built all the memorials here, even for the Australians. At Albany in Australia, we've got the big statue of the horse, the 2 horses. That was actually in Egypt, and then it was brought back to New Zealand. So the New Zealand government paid the Australian government to bring it back to Albany. But, so all these sort of things. But we never looked after the living. They were just forgotten. And that's the sad part, is that a lot of these men came home, some got on with their lives, and they put it all, and that's why they never spoke. They knew if they, sometimes it would blow them out. Others came back, drunk themselves to death. Alcohol is a major factor, it's still a major factor today. Some come home. We've got soldiers today who are homeless. We don't look after them. Even the armed services, they've got no way. We really need to start thinking about, because people say, being pacifists and all that, but they've served our country, our politicians sent them there, so by rights, they should look after them. Okay, they might come home broken. They might be, damaged goods, but we don't deserve to abandon them. We look after refugees, we look after everybody else coming in. We fail dismally, both here in Australia and New Zealand, everywhere in England. We do not look after our own. Why, I don't know. It seems to be that culture that we look after everyone else, look after our own. I get a wee bit passionate about that because
So
you
that
see.
is something I feel quite passionate about as well.
I know I can't do anything about it.
Yeah, but is that something we should highlight?
Yeah, when like at the at the end, these men.
Should it be like he comes home, he's expected to go back to work.
Yeah, he's got to go back straight into a normal life, like it never happened.
Yeah.
And that's where my grandmother said about her brother, was that he'd go quiet, and he went and worked back on the farm, the whole thing. I'm not that bad.
So he goes away really.
He was
fits
a
in
fit.
society, he's
Yep.
a perfect model citizen. He's achieving. He's got these grand dreams. He
Yeah.
goes off,
Yeah.
comes home, damaged, broken, doesn't fit anymore.
Yep.
Doesn't look like-
The whole 9 yards, and he can't talk to anyone. There's no one to talk to,
Except for the bridal.
just for the bridal. Yeah.
What were Anzac celebrations like shortly after the war? Were there any Anzac
Yes.
celebrations?
The first Anzac was actually in New Zealand at 2 years after the war. Last year was the 100 years. So yes, New Zealand had started the Anzac Day, but it wasn't actually on the 25th, it was shifted later. But yes, it was in the first Anzac service was in a place called Te Arawa in the Manawatu. In the Wairarapa, up on a hill. And that was the first Anzac. So yes, they started celebrating all the way through. Yep. There's a...
Oh, sorry.
Yeah?
Is it true that I read somewhere about New Zealand having a lot of monuments? Like we have more than a lot of places. Like in every area, there's some kind of monument
Yes.
towards Anzacs and stuff. Was that because of the blacking out of information, the redacted information coming back to New Zealand, and people losing huge amounts of family? They needed somewhere to go.
To Bamor.
They couldn't go there where they died and visit. They were left with questions and no answers, and what actually happened, and how did they die, and the information was very scant, and they just needed somewhere to go for Pilmore.
Yeah, because one of the things that, like in New Zealand, all these small little communities, they just got together. We're going to make a memorial. Now, where I live up in North Canterbury, up in Harden, right up on the foothills, a place called the Peaks. There's a monument there of Tom Crane. One name on it, at a little school. It used to be an old schoolhouse in the middle of nowhere. There's no other houses, no nothing. They built these little monuments, even in the remotest places you could find. They immortalised the dead. They went out of their way to make these monuments for the dead. They forgot about the living, because the living, they were there. They were going to go back, and they survived. There's, but they hadn't, because they come back, and the horrors of what they saw, not only in World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam. We forget about everything. And when these guys come back, we forget about them. Yes, we do the memorials for the dead, but we should honour the living as well. And that's where, and that's why we're very proud with the mounted rifles now today. We will go out of our way to say, think about the ones who are still here as well. And it's a tool, because you have a huge half-ton horse, all his gear. It's similar, people will notice, you'll see a soldier in a parade, 5 minutes. But a horse and a man, it seems to stick like a memory in there.
It's quite a...
Especially with New Zealanders.
Isn't it?
They seem to hold that passionately, There have been rides throughout New Zealand, we're a whole group on that, but when we do the Anzac 100, everything is run as a military. They're in formation, they get screamed out like a sergeant major, and some of them hate, I'll be the biggest enemy. I said, right, I don't care, but we will run it in honour of them. I says, you're not here for a ride, you're here to ride for your ancestors, for your history, and be proud of what you're doing. Look straight, look tall, ride tall. And that's how I try and envision people to really take heart. And with this film project, that's another tool to get our history, and it's going to be a legacy that everyone who takes part in this project will be proud to have. And that's the most important. It's not about one individual who did this and do that. It's from the tea lady, right to the director, right to the producer. Everyone has a part to play, and they're just as equal, and that's the legacy we're all going to carry with this project.
I have a question that I'm surprised I haven't asked yet. Are they still around, the mounted rifles?
There's one regiment left in New Zealand. It's called the Queen's Alexandra Mounted Rifles, based in Linton.
And are they more of a...
They're an armoured personnel carriers. They've got, you know, like the labs and all that. So they're all motorised. So yes, they've gone through.
Is that one regiment?
Just one regiment. That's the Queen's Alexandra Mounted Rifles. And they had their 150th anniversary, I think about 3-4 years ago. And they had a group of horses, part of the parade through Palmerston North and all that. But the soldiers, you know, they just would do a bit of training and that, so they were thrown in the deep end. So that's the only regiment we've got left in New Zealand.
That has horses?
No.
No, they...
There's no regiments in New Zealand got horses, but they're still called the Queen's Alexandra Mounted Rifles.
Are they still sort of seen as a more secretive
No.
SAS
No.
style type?
No, the SAS take that part, the Special Air Service. They do all these sort of reconnaissance. So the mounted rifles was the forerunner of all that history going through, because they did the skullduggery. So it sort of went from there to the long range group, all that. So, and then to the boat, all that, and then it gradually went from there. So if you look at your history books, yeah, they would have learnt from those little skirmishers, went from there. But the Queen's Alexandra Mounted Rifles, they're just a regiment of serving soldiers with labs and machinery, so they're a regiment is what they're called. But they're the only ones left who keep the name of the Mounted Rifles.
And no horse units at all?
No, no horses units. In Australia, yes, they do. Yes, yeah, in Australia they have for ceremonial stuff. They are apparently, I'm not too sure on this, but in North Queensland, they're actually going back to horses to patrol through the Everglades and everything, you know, up in the back area, because they can get round where they can't with vehicles and all that. So they're actually going back to patrolling the borders up round North Queensland and through the Gulf there using horses. So that's back in Australia.
So really we've only got police here that use horses?
No,
They don't use them anymore?
No.
Do they? Don't they?
Haven't seen
Only-
one for a long time.
No, I suppose
No.
not.
St John's has, like in Christchurch, they're the only ones in New Zealand that actually have two horses. They do events, you know, and they go out riding like on horse events. They all take two horses out in St John's uniforms and all that. So the only one that's running at the moment in New Zealand is the Mounted Rifles, the New Zealand Mounted Charitable Trust, which is the only one, is a trust that actually runs the horses, you know, and we do a lot in the South Island. We do a wee bit in the North Island, like we're setting up 2 units in the North Island, which I'll do this weekend coming up. I'll be in the North Island with 4 horses doing the Anzac Hall, which is the last Anzac Hall in New Zealand, the 100 years there. So we're doing that, and we're training one up in Auckland to be able to do ceremonial stuff as well. But the interesting part with our mounted rifles is that a lot of ex-servicemen are now joining up to take part. Like one of our riders, Mark Donaldson, he's 76, riding horses. Ex-Navy man, very proud to ride. And he does that. And we use Mike as the New Zealand flag bearer. And he carries that flag absolutely proudly, you know. And when we do our major events, we always ride as the Anzac riders. We always carry the Australian flag. We've put the Light Horse Association a bit to shame. We always carry the flag. And we put an Aussie rider in, dressed in that gear, just because we are the Anzacs.
Are you telling me they don't put a Kiwi flag or Kiwi rider in?
A lot of their rides, no. Yeah, it's only just when they've started following us here in New Zealand. Oh, we better do the same thing. Because we went over in 2015 to do the Billy Singh Memorial and Fort Linton and all that, and we rode with the Australian and Kiwi flag. And when we did the 2015 ride in North Canterbury, we brought the Australian Army over, one of their riders, and a whole lot of Australian riders. We rode with as the Anzac riders. Same in Kaikoura, we rode with the We were the Anzac. So we're trying to keep that tradition alive. And with the Australians, we're trying to educate them a wee bit that Anzac is not Australia. They've got to work out the NZ part as part of us as well.
Well, they are a bit sick.
And what's special about like a mounted rifle group? I mean, why would a brigadier use them? Like, what type of special mission in Turkey would they be sent to do?
They would send mainly like to do skirmishes behind the lines because they were fast, they were movable, and they could transport long distance behind the line. They was also, because of the conditions they worked in, the horses could get over the country faster than the foot troops and the heavy machinery that came behind. They could cover the country a lot faster. So the brigadiers would use them to move and penetrate, push. By that time, the rear would come up. And so quite often that the mounters would take a position, hold it, and then the rest would come up and reinforce it. But there are some times where the reinforcement wouldn't get there in time and they'd have to pull back, come back to the next line and retreat or that. Like the Battle of Gaza 3 times in Jerusalem, they had to go 3 times to go and crack at it because they get so far, then they had to come back because the reinforcement wasn't coming up fast enough. They'd get bogged down or things like that, like the rivers or crossings, there's stories where the Mounties used to swim the river and hopefully get over there, take a bit of a point, claim it, then get everybody else swimming across the river with their horses or pontoons and that, and then be quickly, So you'd have that sort of skirmishes. So they were always pushing ahead, trying to, and outflanking, So when you get the flank, you get the main body of infantry, like the Turks there, you'd have flanking movements to come around and try and do a pincer, cut them off, and that's why they ended up with a number of thousands of troops in surrenders, because they would outflank them and come around and cut their retreat lines off. It was quite a common practice for them. And so that's why the Mounted were very good at that. They go, we'll go around the back. And they would, and then all of a sudden they'll be fighting on all 4 sides.
Weren't the Turks quite good at guerrilla warfare as well?
Oh yes. The Turks were great soldiers. They were brilliant soldiers. They weren't something coming out of the farmlands. They were brilliant soldiers. They fought, That was not an easy task.
Just their horses let them down.
Well, and their commanders. It was their commanders that let them down. The soldiers, like the Turk soldiers, were great. They were just as good. They've been doing it for, but their supply lines, their commands, their backup stuff left them. So some of the Turks starved. They were so hungry. They were quite happy to surrender because they hadn't eaten. And that's where we had the advantage, even though some of us were starving, but we did get fed. But a lot of the Turks were really, no water, no nothing, the whole night. And it was a lot of the commanders, so there was a lot of bitching, there's more in the history, which I don't know, is that, with the Germans and the Turks squabbling amongst themselves, who was going to do there, and because of the high ranking or echelon, it's just same in the British. That family had that, we had that, and a lot of mistakes were made, and the ones who paid the deal price were the men on the ground, it was the soldiers. So yes, the Turks had the same thing, and they were virtually abandoned, and so you've got to remember, it's always the foot soldiers that are usually abandoned because the upper echelon had their program. Yeah. Some of the Turks' high-ranking officers had servants, manservants, that had 5 or 6 horses just to carry their kit and everything, and set up there, the tablecloths, the whole 9 yards, and hello dear. Yeah, it was, the whole thing. We're fighting like that we were doing the 1800s. And the same with the Germans, who behaved like that. But the real men, they paid dearly. They were left. They were just cannon fodder, as I call it. So that's really hard.
Yeah, that was one of the things I actually liked about War Horse, even though it was a bit weird, is it actually just showed the other side as well, that both sides were, both men on the ground,
Yes.
were both the same.
We were exactly the same,
Yeah.
but working for different masters.
Yeah, exactly.
But, I've seen some documentaries of the young German lads in World War II. My heart went out to them. I thought, oh, you poor buggers. Even though they were on the opposite side of the fence, they were 16, 15, 14-year-olds. They know nothing of life. And they were thrown in this element to be a soldier, and they knew, and they'll say, we had, in Britain, there was thousands of young 16-year-olds went, lied about their age, went. We had it even in New Zealand. There's a number of soldiers who lied about their age. You know, in those days, records weren't that brilliant. And if you looked that, you could ride or you could march, right, you'll do it. And some of the boys forged their parents' signatures, the whole 9 yards. And they went. All for the king and country, you know, that romantic. And at the beginning of the wars, if you look at publicity, it was the glory, what you're doing for your country.
I may have missed some of it, but is this right? So what was it like for a typical mounted rifle person before they even got conscripted? Were they already in the military and had horse training?
No.
Or were they like asking guys from Timaru who knew how to work with horses and guns to come and had it?
Well, in the beginning, when they had the big campaign, you know, when the war was on the horizon, and they said, come and serve king and country. And the first wave of all the volunteers came off, they had their horses. A lot of the big station owners, because Canterbury hadn't been divided up into the smaller blocks after the war, it was still massive big stations. A lot of the station owners actually paid for the horses to go, paid for the guys' uniforms. Up in my area in North Canterbury, there was a chap called Rutherford. He actually paid for all the soldiers and horses for the uniforms, the whole 9 yards, to send them off. So you had that first wave. In the second wave, yeah, things were starting to go. So they had the government buys going around buying horses. And you feel fit and able, and a lot of the young guys, oh yeah, some of them couldn't even ride and thrown into the mountains. So you only had maybe a month, a crash course. If you're going to make it, if you stayed on, you're in. So you had that come hell or high water, you know, and that's how that. And then a lot of them had probably never ridden a horse in their lives, but they were thrown in, you ride, bang, and then gradually. And then you'd found that once they got the hang of it, a lot of them, when they, for some strange reason, the bondship, even every time I get a new horse, you get that bond, you know, you think, oh yeah, you go out there and muzzle his nose, and scratch his ears, you talk to him, say a whole lot of things, and he just looks at you, smiles, and yeah, right here, yeah. And they listen. You know, horses are great listeners, never argue. You know, you never get an argument, but that's what the men were doing, you know, when they had their bad days in the desert, or they've trooped for miles and hungry, wet, or dust storms. There'd be many times they'd be just talking to their horses, have a conversation. And the horse quite often would, they'd lay their head on their shoulder and just listen to you. So that was the form. And in those days, because you didn't talk to your soldier.
Yeah, because you wouldn't cuddle your mate.
No.
But you would get a bit of affection.
Yes,
from the horse.
from your horse. You could wrap your arms
Yeah.
around him, or just lean up and, you know, and stroke him. Because in those days, you never hugged your mate, because that was not PC. Well, the P. Yeah, blokes don't do that. They sort of stand off. But get them alone, and I've seen it many a times. Even there, when you see them alone, and I know these guys, you know, oh yeah, real muncher, like we had in the Anzac, and I've gone around after dark when they've had them all penned up, and every now and again you see one guy over there rubbing his horse and having a smoke. And, oh yeah, he's having a chat. But that's what they did in there, because there was no other comment, and they could talk or write their letters, because quite often in the heat of the day, they'd sit underneath their horse and write their homeward letters.
Because that does isolate you from
The rest of the world.
Brigade, because
Yeah.
you've got to protect yourself.
Yeah, you've got this body of an animal, you know, he'll be just standing there, his head hanging down, and you'll be between his legs and writing it, you know, the only bit of shade you could find. And it's quite often, and they'll be there, and he'll be quite happy. Or he'll be laying on the ground, and the soldier will be laying, and you just feel that power come between the man and the horse. And you can't tell that. You can't put it in words.
No.
If my horse gets killed, do I go back into foot soldiers, or
No, you get another horse. Yeah. What happens is if your horse is killed, then you get another horse, and then you're gutted. I know a lot of the men were, you know, in their diaries, they were gutted, they lost their horse. Or if the soldier was killed, their horse would be taken in, go to another soldier, or to the what we call the reinforcements coming in and filling in. We'd bring in more horses coming in for reinforcements, filling up the gaps. of each battle, you know. And so, yeah, and then you'd be working at it, and then after a while, that bond would grow very quickly because that was your lifeblood. When you're in the desert, your horse was you, because there was no other way you'd get round. And so, yeah, they developed that bond very quickly.
When they were fighting, and you were fighting another unit on horse, would they shoot at horses, or would they?
Yes.
They would?
Yes.
Even though they loved horses, they would shoot at other
They'd
horses?
you'd shoot at anything.
So you just shoot at anything?
Yeah, and the machine guns emplacements, you know, they just took out everything. Didn't matter whether it was man, animal, the whole thing, you know. They didn't aim for that, you know, that was it. And it was a very hard, that was one of the things that came out in my grandmother's brother's diary, was the screaming of some of the horses dying. Across the desert. Yeah, can you imagine, you know, the horses neighing and
Was this
agony.
enemy horses?
Both.
Both. So after a battle,
Yeah.
they had to abandon a horse.
Yeah.
Couldn't
Been
move.
shot, couldn't move, or walking on 3 legs. Or, it happened. You know, blown.
Were horses interchangeable? Like, could Turk horses be used with the army?
No. No, it's sort of, a lot of the Turks, they didn't have as many horses, they were mainly foot soldiers. So they, you know, and the local people, when things, you know, you'd have horses strayed all over the place, and the locals would grab them and gone. But
Locals would grab them.
yeah, but a lot of the, like our New Zealand mounts, no, they looked after their horses. Anything, you know, if it was a battle, they always came back to the different parts. So yeah, the Kiwis looked after their horses, even the ones that when the soldiers were killed.
And you were saying that there was like a special vet. There was a special place.
Yes, there was a special hospital for all the horses. If they were injured, they'd go back and they'd be nursed and back to, you know, and we had farriers, we had vets, we all went with them overseas. It just wasn't left to into the wild. We had them, you know, the vets going along. John, my cousin, his great grandfather, he was a farrier, and he went over. In the front line, compound, the whole 9 years. So the vet was in the front line fighting, and then he would be doing the shoeing after he'd all come back.
So would a vet go out?
Yes, the vet would go out, yes.
So would he be more likely the one
He'll be
to
more
lay
at the-
horse down
Yes.
after a battle or something?
Well, if the soldier brought his horse in and he would assess it and that, and he would say, well, I'm sorry, mate, we can't do anything, bang. Sometimes in a battle, even the soldier would put his own horse down. He knew it was not going to survive, so he would actually shoot it, yes, they'd do that.
How resilient are horses in battle? Like, apart from a lucky shot, can they take quite a few hits?
Yes, well, it depends on where they get hit. If it's a flesh wound and go through the other side, you know, like flesh wounds and that, you know, but if they get a direct impact, no. Like if it comes in right into the side or anything like that. But glancing sides, yeah, they can survive, you know, it's just like cuts in there. But to take a direct hit, no.
They didn't have any like little...
No, nothing, they were,
They-
yeah.
No protection.
No protection. And because when the planes came over bombing the picket lines, and that's why a lot of the soldiers used to run out there and try and protect the chest of the horse, that was the most vulnerable part. So that's why they sort of went like that, and they would try and protect their horses from shrapnel and all that sort of thing. So, yeah.
What type of training was available for horses before they went to war to make sure they didn't spook as easily around guns and explosions?
Well, we'd have, like in New Zealand, they would have training camps where they'd be, you know, blasting, jumping and all that sort of thing. But generally, a lot of the training was done in the Middle East as soon as they got there. So most of the time they'd be shipped from New Zealand, they wouldn't lay down, they'd be standing till the time they got to the Middle East.
And what... Can they cope with that, or would they be very tired?
We lost a lot of horses on the voyages, you know, about 10%. Yeah.
So how long does it take for these horses? What's their trip like? Is it
About 60 days.
60 days?
Yeah, 60 days standing.
Well looked after on their ships?
Oh yes, they were looked after, yeah.
They just
Yeah.
didn't lie down.
Well, they just didn't lie down, and of course you always get casualty rates, you know, with horses, because when you get them on Clive, you've probably seen some of the photos of the stalls, you know, they're just in little boxes all the way along the ship decks, and there's no room for them to lie down. And the stench was unbelievable, yeah. And the guys went in there and shoveled it. They would spend 5 hours a day grooming them, you know, when they're on the boats, you know, and even in the desert, they would spend, when instead of them just laying in their bivvies, they would spend all day grooming them because they had no water and the problems with sweat. That's the only way you could keep your horse from getting sores or anything, was grooming them, brushing them and scarring. So that's been, you know, and so that's where the bond went. They weren't there just for the battle. They were there after, looking after them, grooming them every day.
Do you mind if we have a break?
Yep. Action, cards, right. Okay.
You're doing such a good job. I feel blessed even just listening to this.
With the going into Gaza, there were 3 battles into that. And the problem was they had to keep going in, going back, and they were forced to retreat and then have another crack at it and going through. So in the Battle of Gaza, that was really hard going into that part, and they worked very hard. And they're probably one of the hardest parts going through there, and that led up to Beersheba and taking the wells, because getting Beersheba was important because there was no water. Everybody, you know, if they hadn't got Beersheba, they were in major strife because there was no water for the horses, nothing.
And this is because they're being blown up everywhere.
Yes, they were going blowing, like the Turks were blowing up, the Germans were blowing up everything to get, you know, when they fall back, they blow the wells and all the whole 9 yards.
So even though they're making ground, they're losing the wells.
They were losing the wells every time they went in there.
Yeah.
And like the wadis, or wadis, whatever you call those, like in the oasis area, they were poisoning them.
Okay.
Yeah, so there was contamination.
That's quite good, because even though they're moving forward, they're making progress, they're actually losing. So
Losing ground.
So
Yeah.
it's becoming more and more desperate.
Yeah, because the water,
In the wells, yeah.
yeah, the Beersheba in the wells. And that was the same in Gaza. They were fighting for the wells as well, for water. Because in the meantime, the engineers were building pipelines, but they couldn't keep up the rate of pace as the advancing battle. And they were building narrow gauge railways and pipelines for water to come behind them.
It'd be better just retreat.
Yeah, but
Go back to the bloody.
yeah, but so when they got too far, they had to go back
They did have to go back.
for water.
Yeah.
So that's where a lot of them were struggling, you know. So you had to be very careful just how far, the limitation of water. Because when they went out on patrol, they only had 1 bottle of water, and they used to fill up their socks or any little tiny bags on the horses, feed for the horses. You know, they'd stuff them up in their socks, the fodder and everything. That's what they used to do, the guys, you know, just to help the horses. So, you know, it was quite a common practice, you know, anything on their bivvy, push a bit of fodder in there, yeah, that's fine.
What we could do to up the ante is, when they get to Gaza, they need water. Maybe there's a pincer movement happening on them, so they need to take Beersheba in the wells, or else they're going to
Well, that's what happened,
die of
a thirst.
thirst.
Yeah, because Beersheba was critical. When they did Beersheba, was that if Beersheba, they didn't get Beersheba, the New Zealand mounts, the Australians and the Indians would lost half our horses just like that. It was gone.
Because in the movie, it was like the British were pounding Beersheba all day, hour after hour, getting nowhere. And it was like an hour before dark or something. And the horses had been standing down for 72 hours. Everyone was about to die of thirst. We have to charge, because if we don't charge, we're all going to die. And that was, yeah.
Well, in actual fact, the Kiwis were up on the hills,
Up on the hills.
taking out the high points before even Beersheba started. So they were coming around like a pincer movement. So, yeah, they were, and they had the difficult part, going up. The Australians had to, eh?
On the horses?
Yeah,
Yeah, they did.
yeah,
The climax of that movie, taking Beersheba.
Yeah,
It is.
it is.
yeah.
Yeah.
So the Kiwis had to,
That's a pain.
yeah, because you go up, they had to go up to come round to take out the high points of all the machine guns and the cannons. And when those points went, that's when they went in. They,
So you could see the Australian charge from the high ground.
yeah.
You could
Yeah.
Now,
see,
when was the last Light Brigade movie made? Do you guys know?
God,
1980.
yeah, it was. It's very old.
Oh, that's fine then.
Yeah, some of the actors, like, they were, half of them are dead.
That's fine.
Yeah.
If it's taken using the new angle of taking the guns,
Yes.
Mm.
Yeah.
and then we get the whales.
And we won't focus too much on the Aussies down there.
No.
We'll just see a cloud
I
of
like
dust.
your, I like the idea of the dust.
Yeah, just a whole lot of dust here.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Aussies in the shit. Oh, we don't mind. Sorry. Any chance I can get at the Aussie, I'll have a go. I thought this transaction revival was supposed to go on. No, we've got to, yeah. They keep pinching everything of ours, so we, like they've got the pavlova, swines. They keep, yeah. Oh, they can have Russell. Yeah, they can have him. God almighty. Come on, guys. Jeez. Don't put that out in public.
I'd love to get Sam Neill on this as a brigadier.
He'd be brilliant. He'd be brilliant. Guy Pearson. Have you know Guy Pearson? He'd be good. Yeah, there's been a few. I think we've got some new bloods around here. I think in Canterbury we could pinch some young fellows who are good actors. We'll train them up in horses to fall off. Just tell them, it's not the fall that hurts, it's a sudden stop at the bottom, so they won't. Done.
I wanted to find out about just what is your philosophy on humans and animals in general. I mean, I know I've got a lot of friends that say stuff like, dogs don't, fish don't have feelings, they've got a short memory, they don't know they're in a little bowl.
They do.
I don't know, like, what's your philosophy on animals and humans in general? Like, do you think we underplay their value, or we...
For me, they go hand in hand in life. You take a dog, okay, though, but they're always willing to give that love. You know, the affection, you come home from work and everything, he's sitting down there beside you, always wanting that pat. Same like I know with my horses, when I come home, I usually yell out, Stella, Max, where are you? And they come hurtling to the gate, oh God, he's home. And, oh God, gee. Oh, they know I'm going to give them something to eat. But yeah, they give me a nuzzle and all that. My cat, man, does she gets pissed off when I've been away, and the first thing she does, she just climbs up on my chest, I'm having you bugger off there. And Nikki's got to stand in the corner, There's been a couple of times, we've both been in bed together, and I hear this scream, and, during the night, I wake up, what's the matter? And the cat's actually bitten Nikki's nose, and she's been sitting on my chest, gone over and bit it, and then sat there, like this, but so animals do have a very lot of passion feeling. Disabled children, they can relate perfectly to an animal, and you'll find, no matter whether it's a dog, a cat, or a dolphin, or anything, it will always automatically. So yes, animals have feelings, no matter what. So you really, we're all interwoven on this planet, we're not just we're the intelligent species. The animals are, because we are part of this global world. And so, yes, I'm a great believer in that, yes, animals do have feelings. Even the old sheep, I've seen pet lambs and boy, they're driving me nuts. I remember as a young lad up on the stations, and this is a classic. My boss's wife had 3 pet lambs, but he says, right, they had to go back into the herd, right? So we drove all the sheep to the summer pastures up on Rainbow Station. So it took us 3 days, cross rivers, cross the whole 9 yards, back up, we got them up into the high country. Anyhow, we rode for a day coming back to a hut, and we stayed there for the night. About 4 o'clock in the morning, we could hear all this bleating. These 3 lambs had brought 1,500 sheep home, all around the front of the hut. All I can remember was that the boss coming out, and there was just a sea of language, and I won't say what he said. He grabs the rifle, and he told us shepherds, don't you tell my wife what I'm going to do. Bang, 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 3 sheep gone. We spent the next 2 days pushing them all back to the high country. He was ropeable, because it was hard work trying to get him up onto the high country. I remember going up a steep bank and I was hanging onto my horse's tail, dragging it up, just give him the reins and off he went. You just hung on, grim death. Up we went. But yeah, sheep have feelings, but they 3 didn't survive. Never pet sheep with a main mob, because they'll bring them home every time. So yeah, it was a bit sad, but 4 o'clock in the morning we heard these 1,500 sheep. Oh my God. And the 3 pet lambs were at the door. I want Carol. Because yeah, she'd sport them, but we never ever told the boss's wife what happened. Yeah. She would have been mortified.
So sheep followed lambs?
Yeah, well, they were young, they'd gone into the mob. There were tutus. We were taken to the high country, so they were rising 2-year-olds, so we took them up to the hills for the summer pasture. So, yeah, what hilarious. So, yes, animals do have feelings, no matter what. I think that's where sometimes we get the myth, and we do see cruelty and everything that goes on. I hate dog fights, cock fights, the whole 9 yards, hate it. But, yeah. So I've always had the passion, always loved my animals. I've taken in stray dogs and they've come to the family and they quietly die. My 2 horses will die quite peacefully in the back paddock when they get old, like me. I won't give them in my frame, but so that'd be right. So, yeah.
So 1913, what was the attitude of the average New Zealanders towards animals? And then the second part of the question is, what is the Army's attitude towards animals?
The Army attitude for them first is they were an instrument of transport, fast manoeuvre. They were a tool of war as far as the Army was concerned. It was to get from A to B at the fastest possible moment to get the men and their equipment to that point at 1913, 1914. For the average person in New Zealand, it was a working animal. It wasn't like today what we've had, more bondship with the animals. In those days, it was a tool for the farm, the transport, the coaches, to make society work. So generally 90% of the people felt it was just a tool to get them to progress on their farms, whatever they had to do. So that's what it was in those days.
But still, animals were valuable because
They
they
were-
were expensive to
Yes.
acquire, and then you really rely, again, on a farm you'd rely on a horse or you rely on your cow.
That was your, if your horse broke a leg, it was money lost. So the horse was more valuable, and sometimes, in some of the old-fashioned stories, is that the horse was more valuable than the wife. I'm going to get something over there. But yes, the farmer would actually value his horse because it was a tool more than his wife and that. So yes.
Maybe how many look at cows today, maybe.
We won't go there. Oh boy, yeah. No, we won't, no. Put that one aside. But, yeah, in those days, yes, the horse was there, especially on farms, because they mustered, they had their wagons, the whole 9 yards. So, yeah, they came to be the value of the farm or whatever staging coach, to get round the whole, the milkman had his horse and cart, the whole things, back in the old days in the cities, the ship can horse that went round and picked up all the dunnies when we had the long drops. Yep, went round every night, the cart man picked up the can, put it on there and took it away. I can even remember that, like even in my day, as a kid on the West Coast, they still had a night cart guy come round back in the 50s. Yeah. My grandmother, she saw the first motor car come into Takaka. She saw the man on the moon, all in her lifetime, in the space of 80 years. How we've changed in 80 years, and today, just like in photography, we used to have these big, huge cameras carted around rolls of fuel. Now we can get it down to a little tiny little thing and still get the most perfect film. We've got drones roaring around where once upon a time we had these big huge gimbal cameras on helicopters, the whole 9 yards. Now we can do the same big budget films, all maybe 7 or 8 guys. Modern technology.
Technology's changed, but I don't think we've actually changed.
No.
And that's why I think these stories are so valuable, because people feel the same then as they do now.
We've never changed.
We don't change.
No.
Those things don't change. Yeah.
We forget, but we don't change. And I think, like, sometimes when you do a story, especially what we're doing here, I'll guarantee it'll affect you in some way. Because, yes, it's part of our history. something that we haven't been told, and now it's all coming to light. And sometimes it'll make you a better person, that you have a better understanding of life and just for where we are, where we're going. And I find sometimes politicians, they have the shortest memory. You know, I call it the John Banks disease. God, you know, I can't remember that. I can't remember that. That's what John Banks used to say. Yeah. But you know, if they really go back in history and start looking at, I think some of the decisions that we make today, and we look back in our past, we might have a better understanding for what we are treating our people. You know, our younger generation now, I look at it today and I think, oh, you know, some of them not even going to make 50 because we have a major problems with our living style, the whole 9 yards, you know. Scary.
What's the, I think you called it, was it Rena House?
I think it's Rena House here in Christchurch. It's a hospital come retirement home for veteran soldiers. And at the moment they're doing an upgrade and they've got to get a lot of hospital equipment to, you know, how to lift patients, you know, so because, you know, to do heart monitors, all that. They're trying to buy equipment. And the trust, we've put in, I think it's $3,000 from what we've been doing with the mounted rifles. So, and the RSAs are doing the same thing. They're putting in all this money just to help to build the hospital. So it's a home for the disabled and the soldiers of yesteryear, somewhere safe, because we don't look after them, you know.
We don't have veterans hospitals like they do in America.
No, we don't. So these are sort of privately run, you know, built together by trusts and all that sort of thing. It's like the Christchurch Trust Hospital, you know, for people who want operations, who can't afford it or waiting on the list. And all these people do it for volunteers. So what we're trying to do is to build up this. We had a big memorial service in Rangiora. You know, the first woman soldier to die in New Zealand combat? Jessica Baker from Rangiora. She was a medic, but she got killed in Afghanistan. We did a memorial with the mounted rifles, and what they're doing is they've actually made a wing in her name in the hospital there, and they're dedicated to that. But each room you can raise money and have a dedication in that. So that's what they're doing. But I can't quite think of the name of the hospital. Yeah, but I've only just found out in the last few days about it. So we've decided to put something towards it, you know. So it's very hard, and we're trying to raise more money to do this. And so every time we take the horses out, we all say, we beg, borrow and steal, can you give us a donation? Then we put it all back and then do that, you know. But it's just one small little bit that we can do in memory for our soldiers, woman, man, and even the civilians who work in the armed forces that have been injured. We can help them because they are forgotten. You know, we still have, which is sad, there's been a campaign to recognise there was 2 New Zealand soldiers way back one of them got badly burnt. I don't know the full story, but he couldn't get compensation, and that went to Parliament, and they've had politicians. Yes, they're entitled to it, the whole 9 yards. Have another report, have another report. You know, the whole, yeah, but, you know, and no one will actually get off their butts, and politicians are notorious making excuses not to do anything. And that's where sometimes we may have to get radical and say, hey, enough's enough. And hopefully, I'm looking at, with this film project, maybe just a tiny bit of that will go back, you know, a little bit of these funds, if we make a profit, can go back and help our veterans. And that will be a great legacy. But as I say, with every person who works on this project, I'm just hoping that it'll instill in them a pride and a sense of history and be proud of what they're doing. And when that comes to the big screen and tells that little bit of a story, it's only a little bit of history, they've got a legacy they can tell for the rest of their children.
It would be great to know it's not fiction as well, that these little stories that
Yes.
you guys are compiling are actually they're real.
Yes.
These are the real stories.
Yeah, well, you've got it all documented, you know, and we're just adding that story to each of these little stories to make, yes, It's happened to our men. Yes, this is our history. We should be proud of what our guys, doesn't matter what they thought. Now, a lot of people say we shouldn't have gone to Gallipoli. It wasn't the soldiers' choice to go. They followed the masters of our government, whoever it was. They just did what we were told as good soldiers. So in return, we've got to do something in return, even if it takes 100 years. So let's be proud.
The New Zealand Prime Minister of the time, like, I find would it be quite an interesting role to kind of explain to New Zealanders, it's okay, it's all going well, please support us. But how do you think he really felt? Do you think he felt betrayed by Britain?
I think.
What was the real?
I think if you're looking through the history books, he actually didn't really know the truth until later on. He didn't know the casualties and what the men were being under command, because when the Australian reporter got the story out about Gallipoli, that's when the New Zealand government and the Australian government jumped in and says, enough's enough, we're slaughtering our men. We didn't know. They had no idea of the disasters that the British Empire was doing with their poor commanders.
But surely they had no idea of the redactions that were going on in the correspondence.
The correspondence was censored.
It was all censored.
Didn't they say that it's weird? Like the Prime Minister would have known that people were getting letters back with most of the information missing. Did they?
But that was under the new censure law. Now the government actually had that going too. They had censorship to keep the population happy. And it wasn't the bad news that was going all wrong right at the beginning, not at the end when we had huge casualties and then the papers start filling up. Is the fact that up until the first 2 years of the war, nobody really knew what the disasters that we were dropping ourselves into. And even the politicians didn't know until that story broke out of Gallipoli. And
it took those reporters a long time to even
well, they had to
get
get
their stories out.
Yeah.
They were all manipulated.
yes.
All
You know,
had
they had
and they would rewrite them and
well, there was a lot of stories that the reporters wrote, and as soon as it got into the mail, they found it and destroyed the story. So he thought the story was getting there, but no, the censors in London and all them in the mail, hello, this, yeah. And even in the mailbags, they go to, oh, yep.
they were trapped and
Yeah.
they couldn't do anything
They
about
couldn't
it.
get the story out. It was only the fact that one of them got kicked out.
That's right.
He took his story and broke it, and it was an Australian.
That's right.
And
He-
I think it was Rupert Murdoch.
It was. Yes,
Rupert Murdoch.
it was.
So
He's-
with that correspondence line, I just need to understand, where was it redacted? Who was in charge of that? Did the correspondence line go to Britain first, then to New Zealand? Or?
It was actually censored in Gallipoli or in the commands in Europe, in Egypt, by the generals and the brigadiers. They made sure all the information was censored. Even the Prime Minister in London did not know the disaster that was happening in Gallipoli until they started wanting more men. And it was then they were saying, hey, what the hell is going on? We're sending more and more. Hundreds of thousands of men going there. What the hell's going on? And they couldn't say we'd captured the Dardanelles or anything like that. They were bogged down. And then questions were starting to ask, because even the British reporters tried to get the information back and they were censored. Bang, bang. It was stop. It was the generals that was censoring everything.
All been under the guise of, trying to keep everything secret.
There was all secret. It was all...
Are they embarrassed? Are they
Oh.
embarrassed? What are they worried?
Well, even when they did the Chunuk Beer, that was a classic. It was supposed to be a three-pronged attack. The New Zealanders were going out one side, the Australians were going out the centre, and the British were coming up the other side. The British hadn't even got off the beach because, one of the generals didn't have a cup of tea. He was arguing over there. They were still sitting on the beach when the Australians and the New Zealanders were taking Hill 60, getting slaughtered, and that's when the Otagos got wiped out. Then the Wellingtons took Chunuk Beer. Door open. Oh, God.
You like Ghost of Gallipoli?
Yeah, the ghosts, they're coming in to give it, but they took Chunuk Beer, and they finally, like the Wellingtons got the highest point of the whole battle, held it, and then they were so decimated they came off, and then the story is that the British dropped their shells too close and ended up blowing half the Kiwis up. Then the Brits went up there and relieved them, and the Brits lost it. So they all came back down to where, and so, yeah. So Canterbury, they got the highest point of the whole battle for the Wellingtons, and the Otagos, they got annihilated. That was the Otago mounted rifles. They got annihilated and wiped out. And that's why the Otago regiment was never formed as a mounted rifles regiment after Gallipoli. So they, and the Canterburys were taking Hill 60, the whole 9 yards, and they were bogged down. The Brits, in the meantime, were still arguing over their cups of teas when hadn't even got off the bloody beach. The Australians got slaughtered. And that, you know, comes out in history. And there's a lot of different versions of what happened, you know. And when they were sending the Australians over the battlements, you know, and they were told not to have ammunition in their rifles, they would just fix bayonets. And they were just going over the parapet, drop, wave after wave. When the third wave was about to go over, a lot of the commanders in the trenches were saying, it's murder, it's murder. But the British officers were saying, go, you have to go, go. And then they knew they were going to their deaths. They were being slaughtered. So that's when the story started getting back out to Australia, England, and then New Zealand was starting to, the whole thing was a fiasco. And a lot of the politicians did not know just how bad it was. And that's why I'm not sure when he went over. He actually came over to Egypt and also into the middle, to France and Belgium to see for themselves. And then they realised just what carnage was going on.
So our Prime Minister, we know.
Yes.
Okay.
So
Why the carnage? Was that a leadership issue?
it was a leadership. Yeah. In the first part of the war, there's so many bad mistakes by leaderships in France and Belgium and including Gallipoli. The leadership issue was a shocker. Yeah. And it was the old boy network, you know, from Sandhurst, the rich families who took command, and incompetent officers because A, they were dukes or lords of their manors, and they were sending their sons over who had no idea of military experience. So yeah, there's a lot of history and there's a lot of arguments. So who do you believe in that? But you just look at the casualty list, then you realise someone made some horrible mistakes. And so that's when with the New Zealanders and the Australians, they said, enough's enough. We're taking command of our troops, and they got New Zealanders and Australian leaderships in to take over. Yes, they still had the brigadiers, but some of them eventually got replaced, and then like the Anzac Mounted Brigade, which was New Zealand and Australians, was actually under command of a couple of Australians. So yeah, we started not having the casualty rates because of the better commands, the whole 9 yards. But a lot of people did not know, and that's why, like with New Zealand, they didn't have an implant of a reporter. You know, they always put in Australia, the Indians, the British. Yes, there was reporters to report back to the whole story. New Zealanders had nothing, whether it was by choice or by command. We never will know, because that history sort of quietly disappeared. So it needs to be found, but that's why they got the term cold-footed mounts, because people in New Zealand thought they were sitting in the palm beaches in Egypt having a wonderful time. They did not know about the real hardship and what the men was going through. You know, the tins of bully beef, which was coming from Argentina, 90% of it was just fat. You know, there was nothing in it. And biscuits that you could actually you build a house with. It was so hard. You know, and they were breaking their teeth. Dysentery, malaria, cholera, all that played a huge part on the mountains. You know, there were always men getting sick, you know, and that's what they had to endure. And then in the winter months when the rains came, they too were in the bog and the mud, just like they were in the Western Front. And they weren't properly at it, you know, they were still in summer gear, shirts, the whole 9 yards, and just bivvy over the top. Had nothing, and they were struggling in the mud. And then, yeah, they had water, but then there's the opposite effect. But the New Zealand horses, were well looked after. That was their priority. There's one thing, and even the soldiers says, the horses are getting fed better than we are. But the New Zealand Brigade made sure the horses were fed. And yes, a lot of the soldiers says, oh, bloody hell, the horses are getting better fed than we are. But they knew, and they made sure. And even they shared their water. When the rations of water disappeared, it's quite often men would put a little bit in their Dixie, give it a taste for the licks of the horses around their mouths. They shared that bond of little bit of water they had, and sometimes only got a pint a day. And that pint a day was to shave, shuff, the whole 9 yards. So hygiene, it must have been putrid, but they had to live there. And remember, a lot of these guys are only 16, 17, 18, 20-year-olds. What an impact on their lives. You know, for the older guys, you know, we could handle it. But for the young ones, and every time you had the new replacements coming in and shoveled into that, you know, coming from home, the green lush on the ships, then slapped into a desert or into the Western Front, and bloody hell. It's a wonder they didn't break their minds.
Oh, it didn't.
Well, it must have, yeah. So the powerful, and so where the men in the desert, they would talk to their horses. It was not. I was lucky to get those diaries of my grandmother's. She, you know, he used to go and talk to his horse. He had no one else to talk to. You know, in those days, men had to be men, regardless how. And he would go and quietly at night talk to his horse.
Have you read that diary, the whole diary? Did he do it for quite a few years?
When he came home, he stopped.
The whole, with the bridle, I mean.
Yes.
Did he do that until he
Came
the
home.
rest of his life?
No. Once he came home, he stopped writing his diaries.
Oh no, I mean going out with the bridle.
Oh yes,
Yeah.
yes, he did it until he was unable to walk. He just every now and again, he'd grab his bridle, go. No one was allowed to touch it. He'd hang it up. Yeah. When my grandmother had my mother and my brother, her three brothers, you know, my grandmother, because my grandmother sort of was, her and I were very close. She, remember one day the kids going in there and they started playing around it and he got very angry. Leave it alone, and the kids never touched it again. They were just hung up in the wool shed. That's it. No one was to touch it. Yeah. I don't know whatever happened to that. I'd love to know what happened to it. But I've actually made up another World War I bridle, and I've got that hanging in my studio. And I've got his name and a brass tag, and I've just left it there for him. Just a bit of a memory. So, yeah. Until New Zealand got our independence after the war, we were classed as the colonials, and the colonials always got the dirty jobs, all that, including the Indians, the whole 9 yards. We were the lower echelon from English, you know, the high society. We were like the Australians were classed as the convicts, they were the colonies. New Zealand was the ones who escaped the society of Britain to come out here to start a new world. They weren't convicts. They were a different type of people who were escaping from colonial side, and so yeah, we were in our history, we were the lower class people. So we didn't matter to, you know, and a lot of the British historically, what do you call them? They always looked upon us as the lower servants, and that's And because New Zealand are notorious to be so fiercely independent, we didn't tolerate it. You know, we're the first country in the world to give the woman the vote. And sometimes I think we are quite lazy as New Zealanders, you know, like our local body elections. We should have compulsory voting. I don't give a rat's ass. Every man and dog should have to vote, because we've won that right of freedom. We should all bloody vote. But we don't have that. We're quite lazy now, our generation. Yeah. In Australia, it's compulsory. You got to vote.
Doesn't know hardship. Doesn't know anything about it.
No.
When have you ever gone hungry? When have you ever feared for your house to be invaded or to lose your rights or whatever? You know.
Yeah. I remember when I was in the foster home, scrounging in rubbish tins looking for food.
Yeah.
And that's only 40 years ago.
Well, actually, we do have.
Well, it's still doing it now.
New Zealand, but it's
Yeah.
really hidden, isn't it?
Yeah. But I think as a people, Britain didn't really consider us as a power, and even the Australians. We were just the colonials. We could go in there and do the dirty work, and the upper echelon of the English the society, they stood back there with their teas and wine and say, oh yeah, we'll plant them over there, we'll plant them over there, yeah, they'll be right. Oh, how many died today? Oh, don't worry about it, it's just a figure. And they wouldn't look at the figures. But because the New Zealanders are very fiercely independent, they said, nah, not going to do that. And so we are. And that's why begrudgingly, a lot of the brigadiers and the generals, when they're out in the Middle East, said, oh shit, these horses are brilliant. The Kiwi horses knew, and they had the better stamp. It's in the books. It's all written up, what their comments are in these books that I've sent you. And they're saying, oh yeah, they have fine horses. So at the end of the war, we'll take the best. And they did. They took all our best horses.
That's good
Bastards.
way, isn't it? Well, it's good. At least it saved them.
Yeah, it did save them. Yes, it did save them. But, yeah, but we didn't get any thanks for it. Yeah. It's only the fact that we're trying to tell the history now that, hey, you guys, you have a share. But at the moment, now with the Anzac horses, we're getting a bigger following because people are saying, oh, and people are actually, and the advantage of doing the story and the Anzac 100s is that a lot of the diaries that's been hidden for 100 years, all of a sudden are popping out. It's amazing, you know, we've picked up about 20 diaries, you know, coming, and they've never shown the light of day. Little tins and saddles and medals all coming out because of the Anzac horses. It's amazing.